Hello everyone, and welcome to my review for Dragon's Dogma 2. I'm your host, Colors Fade. To start, I want to point out that I never played the original Dragon's Dogma, so I'm coming at this game from a completely fresh perspective. I have no idea how much the sequel relates to the first game, or how closely the core mechanics match those of its predecessor. I'm viewing the game strictly through the lens of a player new to the franchise. That said, Dragon's Dogma 2 is a mixed bag. It does some things really well and other things very poorly. And yet, it's still incredibly fun to play, and I think a big reason for that is because it gets its core gameplay loop right. Combat is the biggest part of the game and the thing players will be doing the most, and along with class builds and exploration, these are the features that the developers nailed. The rest of the game, the writing, side quest, NPCs, enemy variety, and dungeon design fall massively short of what it should be and what this game deserves. Before I go any further, I want to take a minute to talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the microtransactions. The discourse around these has been extreme at both ends of the spectrum, with very few sensible takes occupying the middle ground. I want to be clear about my stance on microtransactions. I think they're a predatory business practice and a blight on the gaming industry. And I think content creators, especially those with large audiences, should emphatically call them out whenever they see them. The only thing we gamers can do is raise our voice and tell publishers to please stop putting these awful predatory scams in our games. The unfortunate circumstance with Dragon's Dogma 2 is that a lot of people who raise their voice also happen to be grossly misinformed. As a result, other content creators felt the need to waste their time debunking that information, and in turn, the microtransactions didn't receive the legitimate scorn that they deserved. The truth about the microtransactions in Dragon's Dogma 2 is that they're a scam. This is a single-player game and there's literally no reason for them to exist. Functionally, you don't need them and all the items can be obtained in the game just by playing. Capcom is hoping to fool players into thinking they need these things, and I'm sure that more than a few unwitting gamers bought them. That's part of the scam, and that's why they're so predatory. A second argument has been made that in order for these microtransactions to exist, the developers had to purposefully design inconvenience into their game so that players would want to purchase them. This argument largely revolves around the items that help with fast travel, but I think this is a specious argument. I don't think traversal in Dragon's Dogma 2 is actually designed with microtransactions in mind. Instead, I think it's a purposeful design decision for other reasons, and I'll get to those reasons later in the review. For now, I just want to reiterate my stance on microtransactions. They are a predatory business practice, and publishers need to stop putting them in games. For anyone interested in buying Dragon's Dogma 2, you don't need these microtransactions and you shouldn't buy them. For the uninitiated, Dragon's Dogma 2 is a unique party-based RPG where the player takes on the role of the Arisen. A dragon has ripped out the character's heart and eaten it, thereby marking the character as their foe. It is the Arisen's job to grow powerful enough to defeat the dragon. Along the way, the Arisen can call upon the aid of pawns, special companions that only they can command, or so we're told. There's an imposter Arisen currently sitting on a throne, adding to the drama, but unfortunately that part of the story is pretty thin and poorly written. Literally everyone in the game refers to you as the Arisen, to the point where I wondered why the imposter existed at all. Clearly the common folk of the realm aren't fooled. At character creation, the player constructs their own custom main pawn that will always travel with them, and then later on they can summon 2 additional pawns from the collection of main pawns that other players have created. Renting other players' pawns earns the owner a certain amount of Rift coins, which is one of the game's currencies. Thus, it pays to create a desirable main pawn that is both attractive to other players and also has good combat skills. As the player levels up, their main pawn will level up with them, but rented pawns do not earn experience and only level up when their masters do. Thus, typically the player will outlevel their hired pawns, which necessitates additional trips to the various rift stones scattered across the realm so they can summon higher level companions. Fortunately, the game allows players to save pawns to a list of favorites in case those pawns level up and the player wants to use them again. And the process of searching for new pawns is fun and interesting, with a variety of rift stones that specialize in certain kind of pawns, like those with distinctive marks on their faces. The pawn system of companions is one of the features that makes Dragon's Dogma completely unique in the world of party-based RPGs. It's a bit odd at first, not having handcrafted companions like a Minsk or a Shadowheart, but it works. Of course, since the pawns are created by other players, familiar issues arise, as they always do when players are given the freedom to create content for a game. Remember, this is how we got Bodie McBoatface. With pawns at the ready and a rail-thin main quest to prod the player along, we set off to explore the world. This is where the game simultaneously shines and is also a bit aggravating, at least for some players. Much has been made about the fast travel options in Dragon's Dogma 2, which is restricted to the use of ox carts and port crystals. Ox carts only travel between a handful of cities, so their usefulness is limited. And as for port crystals, when the game begins, only 2 of them exist. Fortunately, players can obtain a handful of other portable port crystals that can be placed just about anywhere in the world with few restrictions. The player can then toss a fairy stone in the air and travels directly to any port crystal they choose. That said, the fairy stones themselves are also a limited resource, so it's not like players can hop around the game world at will once they get their port crystal network set up. When it comes to these restrictions on fast travel, I don't think it was intentionally done to sell fairy stones via microtransactions like some people have suggested. Instead, I think it's simply designed to encourage players to engage in the game's combat, which is really its best feature. Personally, I didn't have an issue with unlimited fast travel, but unlike the vast majority of players, I prefer to play open world games without using fast travel at all. The best of these games have always been the Bethesda titles for me, especially Skyrim and Fallout 4. But I'd also throw in Ubisoft's games like Far Cry, Assassin's Creed Origins, and Assassin's Creed Odyssey into that mix. They all have huge open worlds that I love exploring, and I'm never bothered by having to retrace my steps. I'll take the immersion over the inconvenience every time. If I can, I'll disable fast travel with a mod, and if I can't, I'll just do my best to ignore it. The reason I don't use fast travel is because I prefer to tackle quests in a geographic order, which to me makes it a far more immersive experience. I think the way most people play open world games is by following their quest journal, which can take them all over the world in a random fashion. I don't follow my quest journal. Instead, I take a look at the map and figure out what quests I can accomplish along a particular route. If the main quest in Skyrim asks me to travel from Riften to Solitude, for instance, then I'm going to choose a route that allows me to knock out several other quests along the way. Any quests not on that route will have to wait until later. I find this manner of geographic route-driven play to be far more enjoyable and immersive than following a quest journal and using fast travel, but I also realize most players don't play this way, and being forced to cover the same ground over and over annoys them. For them, fast travel is a means to skip repetitive content, and I get that. But for me, eliminating fast travel is what makes open world games work, and because of that, Dragon's Dogma 2 is ideally suited to the way I like to play these sorts of games. There is, however, one caveat. The world in Dragon's Dogma 2 is probably the least open world I've ever encountered. Despite the huge map, many of the game's areas are reduced to narrow passages carved through impassable mountains, which makes the game feel at times like a well-disguised rail shooter. There are very few opportunities to wander off the beaten path, and when those chances exist, they usually result in short trails that loop back to the main path or into small, underwhelming dungeons. And that's another point I want to emphasize. The dungeons in Dragon's Dogma 2 are underwhelming at best. They lack size, scope, creativity, and any sense of adventure, danger, or rewards. Most of them are little more than crude tunnels burrowed into the ground. In terms of exploration, Dragon's Dogma 2 could have benefited from far more interesting dungeon designs. In fact, a lot of the world design in Dragon's Dogma 2 is a bit bland. Mountains are basically huge swaths of boring grays and browns with few trees to break up the monotony and little in the way of unique landscape aesthetics. That said, the lighting in the game is some of the best I've seen. Dungeons are suitably dark, even with lanterns on. And the world of Dragon's Dogma 2 has the very best day-night cycle transition I've ever witnessed. Witcher 3 has prettier sunsets, to be sure, but the transition from day to night and back again is as good as I've ever seen. More than a few times I stood on the edge of a cliff and watched the sunrise or the sunset just to witness how lifelike it looked like. Speaking of dungeons and rewards, the loot in Dragon's Dogma is underwhelming as well. Almost all of the core items, particularly the weapons and armor, are bought from stores. There are treasure chests aplenty scattered about the game world, but it is incredibly rare to find any weapon or armor loot in them. The game even makes a joke about this, giving pawns a line of dialogue about how disappointing it is to loot an item that immediately makes a recent purchase redundant. It's good that Capcom is aware of this issue in these sorts of games, but I find their solution lacking. I'd rather have a chance at better loot when I open a chest than whatever this garbage is. The bread and butter of Dragon's Dogma 2 is the combat. It's not nearly as punishing as Elden Ring or other Souls-like games, nor is it as easy as other third-person games like Assassin's Creed Origins. The difficulty sits somewhere in the middle, where there's enough challenge to reward players for good gear and effective class builds, but it's never so difficult as to be frustrating. The combat is visually appealing and makes really good use of the third-person camera angle, and climbing onto huge boss creatures is a lot of fun. Additionally, sometimes the player can find a ballista nearby, which can make quick work of some of the game's larger enemies. There are a lot of really fun class abilities as well, like the Thief's skill that allows them to throw a grappling hook and pull harpies out of the air, or the Mystic Spearhand's ability to paralyze an opponent for a short period of time before diving right at them and attacking them. Nearly every class gets at least one really fun skill, and it's part of what makes the game's combat so enjoyable. Overall, this is some of the most fun melee combat I've ever experienced, and it makes a strong case for why a third-person view is superior in these sorts of melee-focused games. Had the rest of the game lived up to this level of quality, had the writing, story, dungeons, and loot been this good, I'd have no problem anointing this as Game of the Year contender. Sadly, the rest of the game isn't on the same level as the combat. Much like how the pawn system is a unique take on party companions, Dragon's Dogma 2 handles the character classes in the same way, with a style all its own. At the start of the game, players choose their vocation, but this is not a one-time choice like it is in a lot of other games where players need to worry about getting their builds correct or worrying about respecialization. No, Dragon's Dogma 2 makes this easy, because the player can not only change their class at any time, but they're encouraged to do so. When a character changes their class, their stats automatically change to match that class. It's strange, I know, having things like strength and defense adjust to the class and not be an immutable part of the character, but this is what allows Dragon's Dogma 2 to have such a flexible class system that encourages players to experiment and switch. When a player changes vocations, the Guildmaster gifts them the first time with some baseline armor and weaponry to match, and as the game progresses, the player can unlock unique vocations that only the Arisen may utilize. Of particular note here are the Mystic Archer and Mystic Spearman, which are both a blend of magic and weaponry, and they are really fun to play. With each vocation, there are a litany of active weapon skills, core skills, and passive skills. The interesting part here are the passives. Once a character learns a passive skill from one vocation, they can equip that passive even if they switch to a different vocation. Nearly every class has one or two useful passives that the player may want to equip by the endgame, so it encourages them to try out different vocations and rank them up, at least to the point where they can earn the passive abilities they desire. I didn't quite understand how this all worked the first time I played the game, but on my second playthrough, I made sure to have a plan for leveling specific vocations so I could get the passives I wanted. The real power in each vocation, however, lies in their active abilities, but there are restrictions. Thanks to this being a console game bound by the limitations of controllers, players can only equip 4 active abilities at any time. This means players need to figure out which 4 abilities suit their playstyle for that vocation. So even within a given vocation, there can be different builds and different ways to approach combat. And then there's the special case of the Warfare class, which essentially trades power for flexibility. The Warfare has lower overall stats but gains the ability to equip any weapon, wear any armor from any vocation, and utilize most of the active skills from the other vocations. The exception here is that the Warfare can't equip the Meister's teaching skills from any vocation, and these are typically the most powerful abilities in any class. So the Warfare doesn't just trade some stats for flexibility, it also trades the best abilities as well. Finally, the Warfare must dedicate one of its 4 active ability slots to the Rearmament weapon skill, which allows the character to equip multiple weapons at once and swap them automatically with the press of a button, as opposed to having to go into their inventory and manually switch their equipped weapon. Unfortunately, this shorts the player an active weapon skill from 4 down to 3, which further neuters the Warfare's power. I understand the developers felt like there needed to be a trade-off between the power and flexibility with this class, but this felt like a bridge too far. In the end, after playing through the game twice, I came to the conclusion that while the Warfare's flexibility was fun at times, and switching weapons was pretty cool, ultimately I enjoyed the raw power of the more focused classes, especially the Mystic Experience. Another thing that Dragon's Dogma 2 does differently from other games is how it handles upgrades. It's not as simple as just looting a few gems and socketing them into your weapons or your armor. Weapons and armor can be upgraded up to 4 times by the various vendors in the world. However, each vendor's upgrades affect the equipment differently. In the starting city, for instance, the vendor will upgrade your gear in a manner that affects all stats roughly evenly. But in the faraway city of Batal, the upgrades are focused on strength and defense, which are better for melee fighters. Likewise, in the remote elven town, vendor upgrades focus on improving the magical quality of items. In the end, this becomes yet another way to force players to traverse the map, and smart players will drop portable port crystals at some of these locations to make return trips easier. While the combat may be fantastic, the writing in the game is definitely not. The main conceit of the story is silly. A dragon eats your heart, but you don't die, and now you're enemies, and at some later point in time you'll have to face each other. Why the dragon doesn't just kill you right on the spot is frankly idiotic, but if he didn't, there'd be no game. This story is made even dumber by a plot that involves a false arisen usurping the throne, which doesn't make much sense because everyone in the world already recognizes you as the arisen on account of your ability to command pawns. Most of the quests that deal with the main story are incredibly lame, and far too many of them involve sneaking into the castle to snatch a piece of incriminating evidence. But the really dumb part is your main contact for all these quests, Captain Brandt, will tell you that he'll leave the door unlocked to whatever specific room you need to get into. If the guy already has free run of the castle and can leave doors unlocked, what does he need you for? Why not just snatch the incriminating evidence himself? Of course, the answer is because the game isn't mechanically set up for stealth play and the writers had to give you something to do to push the plot forward. Still, I had to laugh about the third time I was asked to sneak into the castle. Once was enough, multiple times felt like lazy writing. Anyway, my point is that the writing is really bad, and it's not just the main quest that suffers. Not many of the side quests are memorable either. The two that stand out are the Sphinx, with her riddles, and an artist who wants you to fight a griffin so he can paint it, a job that is made much easier for him if you can procure a Medusa head and petrify the griffin. I really wish the game would have had more quests like this, because it's during these moments, when the game's big boss mobs become part of a unique side quest, that Dragon's Dogma 2 starts to feel a bit like Clash of the Titans, which is awesome. It's fun and engaging, and I was left wanting way more of this kind of content. Sadly, there's just not enough of this, which feels like a real missed opportunity. The vast majority of boss creatures you will fight are simply random encounters, which is fine and can sometimes lead to fun stuff like 2 huge creatures fighting each other, but I couldn't help wishing for more encounters that were tied to interesting side quests with meaningful rewards. Particularly if those side quests would take you to really cool, unique dungeons. The other problem with the quests, besides the bad writing, is that many of them are either buggy or they lack enough information for players to progress without resorting to a Google search. I understand wanting the game to not hold players' hand, but this is absurd. Dragon's Dogma 2 is full of odd design choices, and nothing really exemplifies that as much as the lack of lip-sync speech during normal game encounters.
But you must see that there is no medicine that can heal him out.
Talk to any NPC in the city or any of the pawns in your party, and you'll get the equivalent of an old black and white dubbed Godzilla movie. It's a weird choice given that it's 2024 and the technology for this sort of thing has been around for a while. It's even more puzzling when you consider that the dedicated cutscenes do have fully synced voice acting.
You're dressed rather austerely for a patron.
My humblest apologies, Lady Wilhelmina. We've had reports of an unseemly character in the vicinity, you see, and...
Preposterous.
It's this sort of puzzling design decision that had me pining for a better version of this game. One where the writing was good, the story was smart, the side quests were meaningful, the dungeons were elaborate, and the character interactions were on par with today's standards. But none of those things exist. It's just a really fun combat game and nothing else. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Dragon's Plague disease that can wipe out a whole town if you manage to rest at an inn while one of your pawns is sick with it. It's one of the most creative and destructive features I've ever seen in a video game, and I wish more games would do stuff like this. Your pawns, as well as the game itself, will warn you multiple times before anyone in your party contracts this disease, and even if they do come down with it, it takes a while before it becomes destructive. Players are given ample warnings, not only visually with the pawn's eyes turning brighter and brighter color of red, but also audibly as they'll start back-talking you. The first time my pawn gave me lip, my jaw hit the floor. It was one of the most jarring gaming experiences I can remember, and I loved it. The game provides players with ways to deal with the plague should it happen, notably with a special stone that can revive every single dead person in a single town all at once. But the smart player will be watchful for the signs of the disease and take measures to prevent its advancement. Yeeting your pawns off into the ocean is the easiest way to deal with it, and then head to a summon stone to receive them back into your party, cleansed of the disease. Finally, I need to talk about control mapping. The game is very aggressive up front on the PC about suggesting you use a controller for the best possible experience, and to reinforce that point, Capcom has made the worst keyboard layout I've ever seen. By default, the game expects players using the WASD keys for movement, which is normal, to also press the control key along with a number key in order to perform one of the 4 assigned weapon skills that players have equipped. Did they even test this finger twister setup? This is pure madness, but it's made worse by the fact that you can't remap these weapon attack keys into single keystrokes. Fortunately, Power Toys exists with a keyboard manager, and that allowed me to map many of the more necessary functions to reasonable keystrokes. But the downside is that the keyboard manager can't target a specific app. It works for your whole entire Windows setup. So I was constantly having to toggle it off to go check Google because Dragon's Dogma 2 is so terrible at guiding the player on quests. I'm happy to say that with properly remapped keys, the game plays wonderfully on PC. Movement, camera angles, and combat are all much better for a person like me who sucks at using a controller. This is one of the best third-person games I played on a keyboard and mouse setup, but it sucked that I had to use the Power Tools keyboard manager to make it work. Remapping keys should be a default feature on any PC game at this point. It's 2024 and we're still dealing with this crap, and it's utterly baffling. In conclusion, Dragon's Dogma 2 is a really fun game, and I had a ton of fun playing it. I put over 100 hours into it, but it has a lot of flaws. The combat and class builds are excellent, and the exploration is pretty good, even though the world is a little bit bland and a little bit like a rail shooter. But everything else is just severely lacking. Ultimately, this is the kind of game that will only appeal to people who enjoy combat-heavy games. If you're expecting anything more than that, prepare to be disappointed. I anticipate it will challenge for Game of the Year this year in 2024, but only because this year's crop of games is pretty weak. There's no way this thing could stand up to something like Baldur's Gate 3 or Elden Ring. It's just not even close to being that good. And there you have it. That's my review for Dragon's Dogma 2. I'm your host, Colors Fade. If you dig the video, give it a thumbs up. Consider subscribing to the channel. Leave your questions and comments down below and let me know what you thought of the game if you played it, whether you agree or disagree with my points, and I will see you next time. Until then, happy gaming, everyone.